Well, thank you all for being here, and thank BSA for organizing this wonderful meeting, and don't fall asleep as I'm the last one to go. Okay, so can you hear me all right? Okay, so the Library of Congress now has one of the largest Chinese rare book collections outside of East Asia. So today I want to discuss a critical stage on its long history of collecting Chinese before and during World War II, when a partnership was developed between the Library of Congress and the National Beiping Library of China, located in today's Beijing. And I will talk about why and how classical Chinese books reached the Library of Congress through this partnership. But first, let me explain what I mean by the title, Biblio-Internationalism. So my definition draws on the work of Akira Irie. So in his study of the history of cultural internationalism, Irie traces a surge in international collaboration and exchange in areas such as education, science, and scholarship in the period between the two world wars. He argues that this surge was driven by a belief in the importance of a mutual understanding of the culture, language, and history between peoples from different nations. At the same time, internationalists embraced these collaborations not just to promote cross-cultural understanding, but also to meet their distinct national or nationalist goals. What follows centers on the activities of Yuan Tongli, the director of the National Beiping Library, in fostering a mutually productive collaboration between the two national libraries. I argue that Yuan's actions were motivated by an internationalism involving both an effort to expand an infrastructure in the US for American Sinology, that is the study of China, and also an endeavor to obtain critical resources and support from the US for the Chinese academic community. And I call this Biblio-Internationalism because the collaboration revolved around the exchange, preservation, and study of classical Chinese books. So, who was Yuan Tongli? Yuan grew up in a scholarly environment that gained him access to the network of book collectors in early 20th century Beijing, including some of the most prominent bibliophiles in North China at the time. He received his BA from Columbia University and a diploma from the New York State Library School. And he worked during the early 1920s in the Library of Congress for 3 summers as an intern, an experience that gave him first-hand knowledge of the Chinese collection there. Upon returning to China in 1926, he was appointed as the librarian of the newly established Peking Library, which was reorganized as the National Beiping Library under the Chinese nationalist government, with Yuan as the acting director. The library was the largest collection of old Chinese books in China, mainly because it inherited the court collections from the Qing dynasty, which fell in 1912. But Yuan was also active in soliciting donations and exchanges through which the library could receive modern publications from institutions across the world in order to support the various academic fields that were then taking shape in China. So we can see that as a library director, Yuan really occupied a very distinct socio-institutional position. He had one foot on the sort of old-fashioned bibliophile circle that was still very active at the time. The other foot on the modern, more westernized academic research community in China, and also he was well connected with American librarians and scholars because of his experience in the US. Yuan became acquainted with Walter Swingle during his internship at the Library of Congress. An employee of the US Department of Agriculture, Swingle was an internationalist who stressed the importance of studying China for a good relationship with the Chinese people and also for learning something practical from Chinese history. As a plant scientist, he believed that Chinese crops had the potential to enrich American agricultural practice. So for this purpose, he began to work with the Library of Congress starting around 1915 and steered the direction of its Chinese acquisition for well over a decade, with an emphasis on local gazetteers, materia medica, and agricultural books. So these are kinds of books that you tend to find information on agriculture, on sericulture, on plants, on medicine. So Yuan knew very well what Swingle wanted and supplied him rare editions of some of these books. For example, In 1927, he sent Swingle a manuscript facsimile of the 11th century treatise on lychee. The facsimile was from a copy in the 18th century imperial collection, the Siku Quanshu, that was stored in the Forbidden Palace, which was then being transformed into the Palace Museum. So this copy of Siku Quanshu was not in the National Beiping Library, but a combination of his connection in Beijing and his professional credential as a librarian earned him the concurrent position of the deputy director of the Library of the Palace Museum. So in this capacity, Yuan had access to all the book collections in the former imperial complex, a privilege he took advantage of in making a copy for international colleagues like Swingle. In 1933, he offered a photostat copy of the Ming period Biji, also germane to Swingle's interest. The book was only recently acquired by Yuan's staff at the National Beiping Library and was considered a very rare copy. So photostating was still a relatively recent technology at the time, and in China, there were only 2 photostat machines, one in Yuan's library that he bought from the US. So for the purpose of rare book exchange, what photostating allowed him to do was to make copies of texts for international colleagues like Swingle, while also ensuring the domestic custody of the original book. This was actually a major concern for the Chinese because in the decades prior to 1930, numerous cultural objects, not just rare books, but like bronze vessels, murals, and sculptures were taken out of China by foreign expeditions. So the idea of national cultural heritage was developed, that needed domestic protection was developed in response to this recent history of imperialism. And in 1931, the Chinese government also passed a law that prohibited the export of cultural relics prior to 1850. So in this context, the photographic technology's ability to separate texts from their traditional medium would fulfill the national imperative of safeguarding rare books while also ensuring the text's international circulation. Starting from 1928, Yuan worked more closely with Arthur Hummel, who was appointed as the head of the LC's newly created Division of Orientalia. A former missionary to China, Hummel was an internationalist just like Swingle. But as a professional sinologist, Hummel wanted to build the division into a more comprehensive collection and to make the LC a center of worldwide sinological research. As a result, Yuan sent Hummel whatever he could get hands on in Beijing on a regular basis. So the largest of Yuan's offer for Hummel was actually the private library of Wang Shunan, a former Qing official who decided to sell his personal collection in 1928, perhaps out of financial necessity. So Yuan learned of this from a fellow book collector who was close to Wang and relayed the news to Hummel. So eventually Wang's library was sold to LC in 1929. So Wang's library had enough editions that would seem to warrant its custody within China as opposed to giving it away to the Americans. But the fact that Yuan acted as an intermediary pushing for the negotiation between the two sides indicates that he was also quite flexible, even as the director of a national library, on the issue of whether rare books should be kept at home or could be sent abroad. So archival records do not tell us his rationale, but I postulate that this flexibility came from his thorough knowledge of the composition of major libraries, major Chinese collections, both abroad and within China, which allowed him to evaluate the value of any particular book or collection for parties that desire it. So maybe Wang's books will be a valuable addition to the LC, but perhaps not great enough for Yuan's own library to purchase, which after all had the best collection of Chinese rare books in the world. So records from the LC archives show that from 1927 to 1937, at least 1,900 titles were secured by Yuan for Hummel. So quantitatively speaking, this actually took up a minor percentage in the LC's total Chinese accession during the same period, which was over 9,500 titles. But qualitatively speaking, Yuan's contributions were extraordinary, evidenced by the lengthy discussion of these books by Hummel and his assistants in the LC annual reports. And as we have seen, this was largely owing to Yuan's network and position in Beijing, as well as his knowledge of Chinese books and book collections. So this working relationship was not just one way. Yuan had been the most active seeker of the remaining volumes of the Yongle Dadian, the 15th century manuscript encyclopedia that underwent severe loss and destruction in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Over the years, he tracked down Yongle Dadian from across the world, and LC actually happened to be the overseas institution that had the largest number of extant remains. Through Hammel's assistance, all the 40 volumes in the LC were photostated for the National Beiping Library in the 1930s. And because the Yongle Dadian contained many pre-15th century texts that could no longer be found elsewhere, these copies became important research materials for Chinese scholars of literature, history, linguistics, and other related fields. The collaboration culminated into the proposal of a formal exchange program between the two national libraries in 1936. Initially suggested by Yuan and coordinated by the American Council of Learned Societies, the proposal was for the LC to receive selected copies of the National Beiping Library's rare book holdings, while the latter would get, quote, scientific articles and the like, end quote. So this vague phrasing that's in the correspondence between the two sides suggests that the American side was willing to offer Yuan whatever it could furnish that were, quote, so much in demand on the part of Chinese scholars, end quote. So this would make the exchange, if realized, a central channel through which Yuan's library could acquire latest scholarly publications from the West for Chinese academics and scientists. The most innovative aspect of the proposed exchange lies in the use of the microfilm, as opposed to the printed matter as a medium of exchange. As a technology, the potential of microphotography had just been realized in the US earlier in the 1930s. So the camera to be used for the exchange was custom-made by Dr. Rupert Drader, a surgeon in the US Navy and one of the first designers of microphotographic cameras. So similar to the photostat, microfilm could promote the international circulation of Chinese texts while keeping the rare books at home. And compared to the printed medium, it had the advantage of storing much larger quantities of text in much smaller and portable rolls of film, ideal for long-distance circulation and long-term storage of research material. It was planned that microfilm cameras and projectors were to be installed in both libraries for making and reading the film upon a basis of regular exchange. Unfortunately, war broke out in China in July 1937 before anything in the proposal could be materialized. As Beiping became the first city to fall under Japanese invasion, Yuan and half of his library staff fled to southwest China with the rest of the Chinese academia. Fortunately, before that, 102 crates of the National Beiping Library's rarest holdings had been transferred to safe houses in Shanghai. And after a long discussion involving Yuan, the LC, the Chinese ambassador to the US, and the State Department, it was decided that these rare books would be temporarily transferred to LC for wartime safekeeping. And in late 1941, all of them were loaded onto ships that carried them to the other side of the Pacific Ocean. It was agreed that in Washington, D.C., these books would be microfilmed, with multiple copies produced for distribution, both for sinologists internationally and for scholars back in China. Eventually, 2.5 million pages of film consisting of over 2,700 works were produced. Copies or portions of copies were purchased by at least 6 Western institutions, and 2 copies were sent back to China after the war ended. Meanwhile, Wang Zhongming, a staff member of the National Beiping Library and a student of Yuan, was sent to LC by Yuan in 1939 to conduct bibliographical study of the LC's Chinese collection. So this was actually to answer an early request from Hammel, who had been trying to bring the LC's Chinese holdings to the attention of sinologists across the world, but could not find no scholars with enough bibliographical expertise in the US to carry out this work. So one study did result in this book, a descriptive catalog of rare Chinese books in the Library of Congress. And he was also responsible for actually microfilming the National Beiping Library's rare books after they arrived in LC, and he also prepared bibliographical notes for them that's attached to the microfilm. So with the Chinese Communist Revolution in 1949, the collaboration between the two libraries came to an end. Yuan fled from China and settled down in the US, and the 102 crates of books eventually returned to Taiwan in 1965. But I hope I've shown in this presentation the Transpacific movement of Chinese books as an interactive process involving Chinese and American actors who acted upon each other's goals and concerns. From a longer-term historical perspective, this movement of books belonged to the larger story of accumulating non-Western materials that laid a foundation for the rise of area studies in the second half of the 20th century. As a prime mover of this collaboration, Yuan Tongli's connection stretched from the bibliophile circle in North China to scientists in the US Capitol. This reminds us the importance of studying the history of books within the dynamics of social networks, and in this case, transnational dynamics. So the use of photographic technologies enable text sharing beyond national borders without compromising the growing association between rare books and the nation. This calls our attention to the ways different mediums of text were historically understood and deployed. So this research is still not complete. Among other things, there was actually a bookstore run by a staff member of the National Beiping Library that played a very important role in acquiring Chinese books from Beijing, not just for the Library of Congress, but also for the University of Chicago and for Columbia University during the Second World War, so during the war. So, so far nobody has studied this bookstore very extensively, so basically I'm trying to find more archival records about it. So everything that I've laid out today is based on the archival records from the Library of Congress. Their archive is not very well organized, but yeah, I'm trying to dig further into their archive and also other archives in the U.S. and elsewhere. So and to see how this fits into the story of Biblio-Internationalism. And with this, I'll end it here. Thank you.